So I just finished watching Stranger Things season 5 and well, I liked it. I didn't think it was as bad as everyone online tried to make it out to be, but it definitely wasn't as good as season 4 and was pretty meh in some parts. And by far one of the most interesting scenes for me this season was the scene at Hawkins' lab in the Upside Down where Steve and Dustin get into a fight. And they've actually been beefing all season, but this was the great climax. And it's certainly one that got some attention as well, but people didn't go too crazy about it, and that makes sense. It's not an extraordinary event for people to lose their minds over, but it was super interesting and one of the more interesting parts of this season. And I was a bit surprised to find out that most people thought Steve was right in the argument, but I strongly disagree, and that's why I'm making this video. Not to defend Dustin. Dustin absolutely has his own faults, but to show that Steve was more in the wrong in that particular argument, and that most people aren't willing to admit it. Before I go into why, I want to start with some important context that a lot of people don't consider when judging that scene. Now, after Eddie died, we know that Dustin has been grieving, and I know grieving for a year and a half is a damn long time, and some argue that it's forced, but I can explain why. We have to understand that it's Eddie we're talking about, and everyone in Hawkins thinks he's a satanic killer, so grieving someone like Eddie in Hawkins is almost impossible. Dustin can't wear a t-shirt to remember him without being stared at. He can't visit his grave without being attacked. My point is, he couldn't grieve peacefully in Hawkins, and it's really hard to find peace in the fact that Eddie was some kind of hero when everyone thinks he's a killer. So I definitely think that attributed to him not moving on. But don't get me wrong, Dustin was being stubborn, but more on that later. In the first episode of season 5, Steve calls Dustin to help him fix the signal at the radio station, and this was the first show of conflict. And yeah, Dustin was a bit sour about it, but notice how Dustin points out that Steve wasn't even checking up on him. He just wanted Dustin to help him do shit, and Dustin just wasn't available for that stuff. And I'm not saying friends shouldn't help each other out or anything, but if it's one-sided, it can be draining. But this wasn't a big deal anyway. The next thing was Dustin getting attacked at Eddie's grave, and you could say he asked for it, but I just see it as him getting bullied, because why can't he just stop by the grave of a loved one? But yes, here Dustin was kind of wrong. Insisting on putting himself in danger and drawing attention to himself is self-destructive, and he had to realize that it wasn't worth it. So while Dustin was wrong for drawing attention to himself, he wasn't wrong for stopping at Eddie's grave. He should be able to do that without getting jumped. But before I get into the argument, I just want to acknowledge that Steve does care for Dustin, even at his worst, but I wouldn't say he's the best at showing it. Emotionally, Steve is kind of dusty. Dustin is going through it, and if you want someone to open up, I'm not sure gloating when they mess up is the best way to do it. Like, he doesn't have to be Mary Poppins or anything, but he does love to gloat, like a lot. And I'm not even being biased. You can go rewatch all the scenes with Steve and Dustin this season. But anyway, let's get into the argument. Dustin and Steve were supposed to be looking for the fuel generator together, and Steve was showing skepticism towards Dustin's plan. And since they've been beefing before this, I can't say Steve started the whole thing, but he did start this one. So Dustin basically says since Steve isn't being supportive about his plan, he might as well just stay in the daycare since it suits him. And this was supposed to be banter again, but Dustin comes back to check and Steve is still there playing. Now the reason this is wrong is because Steve is being petty and taking Dustin's comment literally, just sitting there despite what's at stake. And he then says Dustin's plan is nonsense and that there is no fuel generator and that he's just stating fact.
Judging by the pissy look on your face, I assume you didn't find the shield generator.
It's here somewhere.
But you didn't find it.
Yeah, not on this floor.
So you were wrong.
What's funny is that there was a fuel generator. Steve was putting down the person with the plan without an alternative, just because he wanted the satisfaction of Dustin being wrong. And I'm not gonna moralize who gets the banter, but this was genuinely serious, and Steve cared more about their pissing contest. He then goes on to accuse Dustin of being selfish for deciding to look for the fuel generator, trying to make it look like Dustin was doing it for personal gain, but that's not true. Dustin genuinely figured out there was a generator, and he knew it was important. There was nothing to prove, just Dustin being Dustin. He then says,
"You're the reason that we lost contact with them in the first place because of your no-show at the crawl."
And yes, Dustin not showing up at the crawl ruined everything, but Dustin defends himself by saying he was attacked, which is what happened. But Steve says that Dustin wanted to fight, and I get that Steve was worried that Dustin is being self-destructive, but he's wrong again. He didn't go after the bullies. He was on his way and stopped at Eddie's. Steve couldn't have known for sure that Dustin wanted to fight. Dustin then fires back with how Steve is all over Nancy, and this isn't like a low blow or anything. It's pretty neutral and everyone knows this. And then Dustin talks about having a good friend, and I low-key thought he was talking about Steve, but then they made it about Eddie and I was like, okay.
All your bullshit pushing everyone away, it's because no one could ever be as perfect as he was.
But notice how Steve says no one could ever be as perfect as Eddie was. Steve is the one that brought it up, and I think Steve was jealous that Dustin at the moment thinks of Eddie as better than him, and that's why he brought it up. It's also why after Dustin says
He wasn't perfect, but at least he knew that, unlike you.
Oh.
He was never fake. He didn't care what other people thought about him. He was just himself. And you know what? He was the smartest, kindest person I've ever met. And he would have solved this in 30 seconds flat.
He then replies with a jab at Eddie. And look, this is one of the most important parts and where I think Steve is wrong 100%. Now, many people say it's true and Steve was right about Eddie's death, but that's debatable and I'll get to that. But sure, let's say Eddie died for nothing and just wanted to play hero. Was Steve right to say it though? Personally, I think no. A lot of people will say it's tough love and it needed to be said, but I just think it's an excuse to be insensitive. Just because something is true doesn't mean it should be said. Like, Steve isn't the brightest guy sometimes, but that doesn't justify Dustin repeatedly making it known.
Keep your metaphors straight, dude.
Analogy.
Yeah? And how exactly do you figure that?
Because unlike you, I didn't sleep through Algebra 1.
But again, let's just assume that it was tough love and it's what Dustin needed. All that doesn't matter because Steve wasn't saying it to help, not for the most part anyway. It was immediately after Dustin said that Eddie's better and smarter than him that Steve brought up Eddie being dead despite that. If you check throughout the season, you figure out that Steve doesn't appreciate banter from Dustin about him being dumb. He took it as more than just banter, and it's clear that his feelings are actually hurt whenever Dustin brings up intelligence, even slightly.
Learn Greek. You heard that tone. You heard that, right?
Because he does care what Dustin thinks and he cares about Dustin in general. So yes, Steve is justified in taking offense and Dustin is wrong for making Steve feel dumb. But let's not act like it's one-sided. Steve just as much likes to rub it in when Dustin fails, up to the point where he actually wanted him to fail. But anyway, my point is that Steve didn't say what he said in that moment out of love. It was mainly out of insecurity and maybe a little care. So Steve doubles down on it, and there are some people who say he's not dissing Eddie, he's just stating fact. But he just happens to be stating fact so aggressively immediately after he was compared to Eddie. Yeah, come on. Generally, that's not how you talk about a dead loved one, even if you think they were wrong. But was Eddie's death actually meaningless? Lots of people say he died for nothing, and I can see why they say it, but I can also show why his death was meaningful. Now, Eddie did save Dustin, and that is a fact. When he was about to enter the normal Hawkins with Dustin, the bats were already about breaking the door, and they would have come for them both. So Eddie lured the bats away from the portal. And yes, the bats could have entered through the portals. Demogorgons cross over all the time, so it shouldn't be different for the bats. Chances are, if he didn't sacrifice himself, the bats would have followed them anyway. And Steve is really being disingenuous in this scene. He says Eddie saved no one, but Eddie distracting the bats is the only reason he, Nancy, and Robin could make it to Vecna undisturbed. And then he said Eddie tried to play hero, and Eddie's death is much more complex than that. He saw Chrissy die right in front of him and he ran away, and being something of a coward was kind of his character. And remember that his life was basically over because he had the police out to get him and regular citizens out to kill him, so he'd be running from that as well. And this time he'd have to be running away from the bats indefinitely. So him sacrificing himself wasn't just about saving Dustin, but about not running for once. So it's not as simple as just playing hero. Anyway, Dustin then attacks Steve out of anger, and Steve doesn't hit him once, and I respect that. It only makes it more clear how much he cares about Dustin, but I don't think he should be praised for it like he is by some fans. Like seriously, Steve is such a great guy for not beating up a kid who he goaded into attacking him by bringing up his dead friend. Funny enough, if these people were in Dustin's shoes, they would do the exact same thing, I promise. So they both make up and have wholesome moments afterwards. But Steve essentially apologizes for going that far, so just for those in doubt, the narrative actually acknowledges that he went too far. Now let me make this clear, I do not think Steve was wrong in their entire, but mainly that argument at the lab. They both have rights and wrongs that make the beef more interesting, and I don't think we can fully moralize one side over the other. Steve and Dustin were just genuinely my favorite parts of the season, and seeing Dustin run from his college to hug Steve was so satisfying and emotional. But this video wasn't just about Steve being wrong, but fans excusing insensitivity just because they like a character. So yeah, this was my Stranger Things video. I'd love to hear your thoughts on everything I've said, or just your thoughts in general. So comment below and I'll see you guys in the next one.